Okay, we're going to continue now. Remember, our question is what God does, and we're looking at the attributes of God that are coming out here. We're going to look at God's unchangeableness, um, and this one is called immutability. That's the theological term that people use. Immutability is God's unchangeableness in his being, his perfections, his purposes, and his promises. Malachi 3:6 says, I, the Lord, do not change. James 1:17 says, God is the Father of lights, with whom there is no variation or shadow due to change. Hebrews describes Christ as the same yesterday, today, and forever. This is really important. God does not change. Now, immediately, we need to deal with texts that seem to describe change. There are passages that describe God as relenting or regretting in Genesis 6 before the flood, in Jonah 3, and 1 Samuel 15. If we look at those just on the surface, they seem to describe a genuine change of mind that God had. We can resolve this, though, without having to violate the doctrine of immutability. We can resolve this in one or really two complementary ways. The first is to realize that Scripture uses anthropo sorry, let me get this right, anthropic language. And I still didn't get that right. You can see the word there. Such texts describe God's responses to change using creaturely or human words that are drawn from our human experience to communicate a genuine relational reality that God does relate to us. He relates to us as we are because he transcends us. We cannot relate to him. Remember, this is the whole idea that there are attributes of God that we they're incommunicable, but God still relates to us. And part of that is by using this language that has a human element to it. It doesn't mean that God changed in any real way. None of his eternal attributes have changed. His character has not changed. His purposes hasn't changed. But this language can still be used to describe things. Now, there is another way of looking at this. Um, there is a change in relationship, not in being. God's unchanging holiness and justice can yield different external relationships as human circumstances change. God relates differently to a repentant Nineveh than to an unrepentant one. This doesn't change any aspect of God's character or his decree. To give you an analogy, the sun's light is unchanging. Now, the scientists among you are going to say, wait, that's not true. Okay, generally speaking, in some notion, the sun's light is, for our practical purposes, unchanging. But it does produce different effects depending on how objects pass through it, depending on the tilt of the earth. We have different seasons. It's not that the sun is changing for our seasons to change, it's that our relationship, our orientation towards the sun is changing. Immutability doesn't mean that God is static or impersonal. It means his perfections, his purpose, his faithfulness are utterly reliable. We can depend on it. And this itself has huge pastoral comfort. The God who promised to keep his people is not subject to change. He's not going to change his mind and decide that he's no longer going to honor the sacrifice of Christ. He is immutable. We do need to talk about God's relationship with time. There's big questions here, but we're going to simplify things quite a bit. Eternity describes God's relationship to time. God is without beginning, without end, and in the majority classical view, he's not the subject to successive moment by moment experiences of time that characterize everything else in creation. Psalm 90 says, from everlasting to everlasting, you are God. We read 1,000 years in your sight are but as yesterday. 2 Peter 3 echoes this. With the Lord, one day is as 1,000 years, and 1,000 years is one day. Isaiah 57 says that God inhabits eternity. There's two models within Orthodox theology to handle this. There's God's eternity is timeless. That is, that God exists wholly outside of and unconditioned by temporal succession. This is the dominant classical Augustinian view. It's Thomistic, and the Reformed theologians tend to adopt this. God's eternity is an everlasting temporal duration. He exists without time, wholly outside of time. There's another view that God exists within time but without beginning or end. This is a minority position, but it does have some contemporary defenders. Whichever model you land on, both agree God's eternity guarantees that he's not bound, threatened, or limited by time as creatures are, and that his plans form the foundation of the world, and they're not subject to revision by unforeseen circumstances. If you're really interested in this, you might be interested in some work by William Lane Craig. He's written some stuff on God and time, and it's worth glancing through. It gets pretty deep pretty fast, but something that you might be interested in. All right, we're going to stop that there, and we'll get you another video here in just a minute.